It's turning out to be a rough winter, and I'm not talking about Saddam Hussein or Brian Mulroney or the ever-popular GST. Hello and welcome to another edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit.
Welcome back, Sue. It's very nice to see that you're back and feeling better.
Thanks, Joe. It's turning out to be a rough winter across most of the country. Today, we'll take a look at how winter weather can be especially difficult for some people with disabilities.
Should employers be required by law to hire people with disabilities? We'll meet two people who have strongly opposing views on the question.
And we're also going to meet some user-friendly household appliances.
But first, here's this week's roundup of disability news.
A disability-related barrier to people wishing to enter the United States has been removed. U.S. Secretary of Health Louis Sullivan has removed AIDS virus infection from the list of diseases that can bar a person from entering the States. That leaves tuberculosis as the only disease that can bar entry. But until the policy goes into effect in June, AIDS-infected travelers will continue to be excluded unless they request a waiver.
The Ontario government is to establish by 1992 a system of advocates to protect disabled adults from neglect, abuse, or exploitation. The Independent Advocacy Commission will provide protection in 3 areas: case advocates to ensure adequate treatment and care, rights advocates to assist in legal proceedings, and system advocates to identify problems in government policy. The government will introduce the legislation this spring.
A deaf association in New Brunswick says sign language services for deaf persons in court cases are limited and may jeopardize the rights of the accused to a fair and speedy trial.
Last December, a 67-year-old woman died in a fire set at this house in Meredith Settlement near St. Stephen, New Brunswick. The same day, a Moncton woman died when struck by a car. In both cases, the accused were deaf and unable to fully understand the legal situation. In the Meredith Settlement fire, the accused cannot use sign language or read.
How can I conduct a fair case?
His lawyer says he cannot defend the man properly, that he doesn't fully understand the charges. Deaf persons are given a sign language interpreter in court. But that's not enough, says the St. John Hearing Society. If the person cannot read sign language, the society says the deaf must understand what they are accused of.
And there are people that are available. It may take some time. It may mean they can't charge the person until a day or so later when this person, a resource person, can be found. But it does mean that they should be using adequate resources.
Deaf persons who cannot understand common or American Sign Language can communicate through what is known as relay interpreting, a series of gestures and mimes. The Hearing Society suggests that such interpreters be appointed by the courts. In Moncton, the man charged does understand sign language, but not very well. His interpreter, Ann Smith, says the language of the law is difficult to interpret, and most deaf people have difficulty understanding.
They perhaps don't get exposed in the same way as maybe hearing people do. They don't understand the proceedings. It depends on their educational level. There are so many things, but it does make it very difficult for many of them to go into the court system and to understand fully what is happening.
In both cases, court appearances were delayed, so lawyers could explain the charges to their clients. But activists say such court services should already be in place.
There has been another breakthrough in research into spinal cord injuries. This time, it's a promising new drug therapy which eliminates muscle spasms. We have this report from Winnipeg.
6 months ago, Timothy O'Reilly couldn't get out of an elevator without severe pain. A spinal cord injury in 1971 left him paralyzed. The slightest jarring movement left him in terrible pain. Researchers at Winnipeg's Health Sciences Centre have developed this new treatment for people with spinal cord injuries. This device was inserted under O'Reilly's skin 6 months ago. It pumps a drug through a tube right to his spinal cord. The drug stops the spasms. Terry Lindell began the same therapy in September.
Things like getting in and out of the bathtub aren't a problem anymore. Getting into the car has been a lot easier, and most things have just generally become a lot easier.
What's also easier is so far there are no side effects. The drug goes directly to the spinal cord, not to the brain. The pump is refilled once a month. Only 12 people are treated this way. Researchers say they hope the federal government will allow the therapy to be used across Canada.
And they'll scrutinize our results, and we hope in the near future an okay will be given such that it can be implemented routinely.
Meanwhile, O'Reilly says he'll continue this therapy indefinitely. He says it's put an end to 19 years of pain. Danielle Kiefler, CBC News, Winnipeg.
There are to be no cutbacks in transit services for disabled people living in Regina, at least for 3 months. The City of Regina has agreed to pick up $30,000 of a $114,000 shortfall. The shortage was the result of a reduction in funding by the Saskatchewan government.
Barbara Turnbull, who was paralyzed in a convenience store robbery in Mississauga, Ontario, 7 years ago, has begun a new phase of her life in an unusual way.
The CBC series, Scales of Justice, premiered last Sunday with an episode featuring a storyline Barbara Turnbull knows by heart. It's her own story, and in a role recreated for television, Barbara plays herself.
It would probably drive me crazy to see somebody else play me and play me wrong.
7 years ago, Barbara was shot during a convenience store robbery in Mississauga. She was left for dead in a pool of blood, paralyzed from the shoulders down.
I know her, Mom. She goes to Clarkson High.
4 men were charged and tried for armed robbery and murder. For Barbara, recreating the crime and trial was not why she was reluctant to play the role in the show.
I didn't really want to portray myself to kind of perpetuate this victimized image and come back to Toronto and try to start my career with this kind of hanging over me.
Barbara's career is journalism. She graduated with honors last month from Arizona State University. But Barbara doesn't think what she's done and how she's handled herself is exceptional.
I hate words like fighting back and courage. I don't think I'm inspirational.
I don't like the way able-bodied people tend to carry on about people with disabilities and how if they were in this position, they just don't know how they would cope. And I think that that's kind of ridiculous because you just do what you do and you just go on with life.
Barbara is doing just that. She plans to take a couple of months off to relax before thinking seriously about work. Joe, I didn't see Scales of Justice, but I know you did. What did you think of the program?
I had 2 problems. First of all, the way they portrayed Barbara Turnbull. I think the audience would feel sorry for her, and I'm sure that's not what she wanted, that kind of a portrayal. The other one was the way that they portrayed blacks in the movie. They were always portrayed as evil people, and I don't think that's correct either. And that's this week's roundup of Disability News.
Coming up, trying to cope with winter weather. It's turning out to be a rough winter for many parts of the country. The prairie provinces have been hit with blizzards and long periods of cold weather in the -30s and 40s. Even Vancouver, which is usually spared the brunt of winter storms, has been hit repeatedly. In Vancouver, letter carriers have been injured because they've slipped on sidewalks that weren't cleared. Uncleared sidewalks also create a real problem for people with disabilities. Brad Sherritt, a member of the DNET team, checked out an unfortunately typical Toronto sidewalk.
Whenever there's a snowstorm, people simply forget that shoveling sidewalks is a necessity for people in wheelchairs. We simply can't wheel in snow. And it's not only difficult in some cases, it's downright impossible. And it also is not only very difficult for people like quadriplegics, it's very tiresome and in some cases painful, but also there's a wear and tear on the wheelchair, which people wouldn't think about either. And generally, I think it's not very courteous. I think people have to realize that we're out here, we are going to be out in the wintertime, so people should take that extra 3 or 4 minutes it might to shovel off their sidewalks.
One of the problems that Brad didn't mention was the fact that people who use crutches or canes, and they use stairs, they have to walk up and down stairs. Stairs are really treacherous when they are full of ice and snow, but one of the other problems is that there's a lot of stairs that are made out of terrazzo tile or ceramic tile, and those can be incredibly treacherous for somebody who uses a crutch or a cane when they get wet. The solution is to cover them with some carpet or non-slip surface. The other solution is just ban stairs altogether.
With more and more disabled people getting out into the workforce, a little snow on sidewalks or steps can be a real barrier to them.
Yeah, and it also creates problems for people with carts or baby carriages, older people, and as we mentioned earlier, even letter carriers.
We took an informal survey of towns and cities across the country to find out what bylaws were in place to cover snow removal.
Kirkland Lake, where Brad comes from, is in northern Ontario. It's a small community of about 10,000 people. If store owners there don't clear their sidewalks, they can be fined up to $1,000.
Winnipeg has a reputation of being one of the coldest, snowiest cities in Canada. Their Works Department takes care of snow removal and clears sidewalks. As a matter of fact, they discourage property owners from doing their own clearing because it makes the job more difficult.
The situation in large cities like Metro Toronto is somewhat confusing because each municipality in Metro has its own bylaws. But in most cases, the property owner is responsible. There's usually a fine for not clearing snow within a set time limit. And if you've let conditions get really bad, the Works Department may come and do the job for you and bill you later.
If you'd like to know more about specific bylaws in your area, call your local Public Works Department or bylaw officer.
I see you've got something there that might help disabled people get through this cold winter a little easier.
I do. It's a catalog that features clothing and other items for people with disabilities. For people who use wheelchairs, there are coats with shorter length backs for women and men. They're easy to put on and they won't get caught in wheels.
There are also cold weather gloves that are fully lined for extra insulation. They have cowhide palms that provide a better grip for pushing wheelchairs.
And if you're heading outdoors on a cold winter day, this coffee mug holder might come in handy.
The catalog also has products for other seasons. By the way, all the people modeling items have disabilities. If you'd like more information on the catalog, write to us at DNET. We'll give you our address at the end of the show. We'd also like to hear from you if you've got any winter stories to tell or if you have any tips on how to get around.
Coming up, employment equity, the great debate.
You'll be hearing a lot about employment equity in 1991. Employment equity refers to the idea that there should be no discrimination in hiring practices. The federal government introduced employment equity legislation in 1986 for people with disabilities and other target groups who've traditionally been victims of prejudice: Native people, women, and visible minorities.
But in Canada today, despite the law, no employer is required to hire people with disabilities. There are no mandatory quotas in place. The federal law requires only that companies report the number of target group members they employ, and the legislation applies only to federally regulated companies, such as those in the financial, transportation, and communications sectors. The CBC is one of those employers. As a result, very few people with disabilities are employed. It's not that way everywhere, as we'll find out in a moment.
Some people with disabilities are urging governments in Canada to establish mandatory hiring quotas. But the federal government says it prefers to give the voluntary approach a chance. And certain employers have reservations about employment equity laws, especially those involving quotas. Earlier, I spoke with two people who have opposing views on the topic of employment equity. Carol McGregor is the coordinator of Disabled People for Employment Equity. And Jerry White is a professor of entrepreneurial studies at the University of Toronto and chairman of his own business consulting firm. He calls employment equity yuppie nonsense and says it won't be accepted by business.
Well, I guess the basic premise is that what creates wealth? It's the risk-taking and capital of an entrepreneur who should have some control of his own destiny in terms of who he employs, how he runs his business, what risks he takes. Government continues to act as an adversary of business, especially small business, buries them with paperwork and taxation, and the idea of one further imposition on them on a quota basis, required hiring based on population distribution or some artificial mechanism like that, other than on the ability to do work and to contribute to the profitability of that individual, is an incredible encroachment on the rights of that person, and in turn destroys one's motivation to take risk, which in turn creates wealth for Canadian society.
Now, you refer to it as yuppie nonsense. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
It's a phenomenon very much of people in the sort of that 35 to 45 age group who somehow believe that government can legislate and impose these things upon people. And it was a very yuppie vogue thing to do for the Peterson government in Ontario. That was a great collection of yuppies from London, Ontario, who tried to impose that concept through employment equity. And of course, it's been very damaging to the province. It's really hurt our international competitiveness. It's certainly added incremental cost to business. Even government departments, universities have been adversely hurt by it because they haven't been compensated for the increased cost in their budgets. And it's been very damaging right across the board. So I stand by my comment that I really do think it's a piece of yuppie nonsense that has I think, no contribution to contemporary economic thought. Remember who won the Cold War? What took down the Berlin Wall? It was free enterprise capitalism, not this nonsense of employment equity.
Ms. McGregor, will you respond to that?
Well, I find it fascinating. It's supposed to be a very intelligent man sitting here beside me, and yet the whole European country right now has quotas in effect, particularly for hiring of persons with disabilities. They have anti-discriminatory practices, so they've targeted for women as well. For disabled people, this occurred right after the war. They have modified it somewhat, and with 1992, with the European Common Market, all countries are joining together to bring in the quotas that he says that are so destructive. Quotas are alive and well in Europe and in Japan and in the United States. Canada is the last industrialized country to bring in a system of equity. Business is saying they can't afford these type of systems to come into place. We cannot afford to have these systems in type. We have 171,000 disabled people unemployed right now. At $21,000 per year, how much is it costing this country? It's costing them over $3.5 billion just to support and keep these people at home, not working, even if they're qualified. We're not arguing that qualified people shouldn't take the jobs. I mean, we're saying we've got qualified people, but we're still being discriminated against on a daily basis. And this type of attitude that Mr. White is demonstrating here tonight only is showing that we're not going to get it. We'll get it because the will is out there. Last September, I think you'll recall the CTV Toronto Star poll, and the number of Canadians, the highest, I think it was 80% that favored bringing in quotas for hiring persons with disabilities in particular. They favored bringing in employment equity. So I really don't think that business may grumble about the paperwork, but it will come in.
Mr. White, final quick comment.
I think all discrimination, especially with qualified talent, is a major mistake and a great waste in Canadian society. But we have to recognize that the small business sector can't carry that burden. And our greatest solution is to equip disabled people in any way, shape, or form. And if I ever became disabled, at least I've taken charge of my own destiny being self-employed. And I have no fears about my ability to take care of myself and my family. The greatest thing we can do for the disabled population of this country is to give those who wish that opportunity the chance to become entrepreneurial and to take charge and control their own lives and not rely on society and government regulation to open the door for them.
Ms. McGregor, can employment equity fix this problem?
If it's done, conscientiously with business and labor and the community, then maybe we'll get something more reflective, because Canadians by nature are not as bigoted as their counterparts to the south. I think with a little effort that we could get everyone working and not have this type of discrimination. Disabled people, why can't they be included?
Federal employment equity legislation will be reviewed later this year. At that time, Canada's Employment and Immigration Commission will be inviting public submissions. We'll keep you posted on further developments.
Coming up, low-tech items with high standards of design.
Throughout this season, we've been featuring developments in technology that make life easier for people with disabilities. They've been arranged in cooperation with the Program Technology Branch of the Ministry of Community and Social Services in Ontario.
The Program Technology Branch also has a traveling show called Independence Through Good Design, which can be seen annually at home shows around the province. In the weeks ahead, we'll be featuring items on display at that exhibit. This week, Richard Dargis, a project officer with the ministry, shows how household appliances can be designed with disabled consumers in mind.
Here we have a tall and narrow kettle. This has several good features to it. The first one is that when you're pouring, the steam is coming up over here and your hand's over there. The other thing that's good about it is that it has a nice big handle. It's easy to grip. It has the instant off feature. You push that in when you start the water boiling, and when it reaches a boiling temperature, it pops out, so it has a safety feature. If we're talking about a person who hasn't the strength to even lift a kettle, they could just simply pour a little bit of water into the kettle, turn it on, and then just tilt it to pour the water out. Over here we have a toaster. First thing is that it's made of plastic. You can literally hold your hand against the side of the toaster the whole time that it's toasting, and it won't burn you. This is especially important for some people who've lost a bit of sensitivity in their fingertips and might burn themselves if they were touched up against a regular toaster. It has a nice big push button, make it easy to make the toast. The other thing about this particular design is that it's got a large, wide, long opening. So again, if somebody has a motion difficulty, they have a bigger target to aim at. Over here we have a product that's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, what it does is it's a slicing guide. You simply move this forward or back to choose the thickness of your slice, and this is your knife in a guide that cuts the bread. The interesting thing about this product that it was specifically designed for people with arthritis in Europe. And what's happened is, over the last few years, it's become a general consumer item sold in most of their kitchen gadget stores. The last appliance we have is an iron. First of all, it's made of plastic, so it's a little lighter than they usually are. The other thing that's most important, though, is it's an instant off iron. So left in this position, after 15 minutes, it'll turn itself off. If you're ironing and you leave it standing still for 30 seconds, it turns itself off. So a lot of safety. The other issue is, because it's plastic, this part doesn't get as hot. So somebody with a bit of a vision problem would have less chance of burning themselves. They'd have to actually touch this metal edge here before they'd be burned.
As we said, those items are part of a traveling exhibition. It's usually located in Ontario, but it's currently in Winnipeg, and it'll be there until the end of February. If you'd like to see it in Winnipeg, contact the Canadian Aging and Rehabilitation Product Development Corporation, ARCOR. And now turning to our mailbag and a letter that we received. It comes from Kathleen Moore. She's an advertising copywriter in Montreal, Quebec, in response to our beer commercial piece. Advertisers are not good corporate citizens. Advertisers are psych war specialists who depend on corporate image, associating themselves with good causes. Sponsorships by tobacco and booze firms have only one aim: to sugarcoat their brand of expensive poison by associating their name with positive aspects of life and society. The ultimate con job.
You can write to us at the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. Or you can fax us at 416-975-5636.
And finally, we've had a few problems with our closed captioning hardware during the last few shows. And one item that was affected was our interview with the Canadian Hearing Society's first deaf president, Catherine Woodcock. We'll be repeating that interview next week for the benefit of our deaf viewers. And that's our show. I'm Susan Pettit.
And I'm Joe Coughlin. We'll see you again next week. And keep those sidewalks cleared.